Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Good evening. Good to see you all. Good to see you all. Thank you for coming tonight. VBS College of Jewish Studies. If you're here and you're young and cute and came for the dancing, that's next door. The rest of us are stuck here. So it's really wonderful to be together. Some of you know that last night we had a memorial for my father who just passed away. And normally I'd be sitting home Shiva. But for two things. One is that if I sat home, he'd get mad at me because he always believed in work. He was a kibbutznik, basically, labor Zionist. And in the kibbutz movement, the word avodah means both work and worship, and they mean that coincidence very reasonably. And second of all, because the thing my dad loved most was Jewish learning. And it's the reason he cherished the synagogue, because this was always a place of Jewish learning. So if there's any place to be to remember Pops, it's here. And he would really love this class. I'm sorry he's not here to enjoy it. And what he would do is he would sit here in his wheelchair with his eyes closed, and you would swear that this old guy was asleep. And then all of a sudden he'd open his eyes and ask the one question that would completely destroy the lecture. You have to take a whole different way of understanding the thing, because that's how sharp he was, even to the very, very end. So we remember him with great love. And this tonight is dedicated in his memory, and I'm so grateful that you're all here. So if you take a moment, put the sheets down on the table, on the chair, stand up, turn around to the folks beside you, and wish them a good evening, and tell them thank you they're here. Good. Now that we've all made friends, so stand up, stay up. We're going to be sitting a very long time tonight. Join me in a prayer of thanksgiving for the opportunity to learn and to celebrate Jewish life together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shechianu v'kimanu v'gianu lazman hazeh. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Come sit down. Like a fiddler on the roof. That's what life is like here in Anatevka. All of us are like a fiddler on the roof, trying to scratch out a little tune without breaking our necks. Why do we stay here if it's so dangerous? Because Anatevka is our home. And how do we keep our balance? That I can tell you in one word. Tradition. Because of our traditions, each one of us knows who he is and what God expects him to do. Dum, 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 dum. Dump, 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 dump. Tradition, tradition, bumper, rum, bump, bumper, rum, bump, bump. Tradition, 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 bumper, rum, bump, bumper, rum, bump, 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 bump. I could sing you the whole song. Who day and night must. That song describes pre-modern Jewish life. Pre-modern Jewish life was lived according to tradition. That is, there was a script. And before you were born, you were on that script. And it didn't matter what your competencies or interests and aptitudes were. If you were a male, you grew up in a home, and at age 10, they would put you into an apprenticeship, and you learned a trade, and you made a living. At age 13, you had a bar mitzvah. At age 15, you were married. 16, you were married. You were a parent by the time of 18. Right? And you practice, that's what you did. Your whole life was governed by a tradition. That is, there were no choices to be made because the choices were not taken away. They were never yours. The choices belonged to the community, to your parents, and to God. Community, family, and God. They made your choices for you. There were no choices to be made. Your whole life was scripted. And when Fiddler on the Roof, by the way, opened in 1964, everyone fell in love with it. Tradition, because it's such a celebration of that wonderful life of tradition. But it's not. Because if you got past the first song in the play, you realized that it's not about tradition. It's about what came to challenge tradition. Remember, tradition includes not only the profession you would keep, not only where you would live, not only the rhythm of your daily life and weekly life and yearly life, but also your most intimate choices. Who you're going to marry and live with. Who you're going to marry and live with. That was also decided by family, community, and God. And the whole symbol is, here's a guy named Tevye, a poor milkman with 5 daughters, and they're all worried because who are they going to marry? And who gets to make that decision? Your parents, with the help, with the guidance of Yenta the matchmaker. It's funny because the word Yenta means a gossip. And who knows better gossip than Yenta the matchmaker, right? And it begins with a focus on Tzeitel, who's the oldest daughter, who's a bissel overripe. She's 18 years old and not yet married, Nebuch, right? And she wonders who she's going to marry. And the Yenta comes in and says to Tevye and Goldie, her parents, I have wonderful news. I have found a match for Tzeitel. Who's she going to marry? The butcher Laser Wolf. The butcher Laser Wolf is Tevye, her father's age. He's a widower. He's a drunk. He's abusive. He's disgusting. Except if you marry the butcher, you will never starve, which is not a bad thing in a culture of starvation. And so Tevye goes to the local tavern to tie one on with the local Russian peasantry, and he sings to life, l'chaim. And on his way back in a jolly mood, Tzeitel is there at the gate of the homestead to meet him. And she says, Papa, thank you for what you did for me. And he's Tzeitel, you're going to be a bride. One day you'll be a mother. I am so happy. And she says, yes, but I'm not going to marry the butcher Laser Wolf. And suddenly Tevye is stone cold sober. And he says, why not? Because I've fallen in love with another and we have promised ourselves to each other. Oh, you have you? And who have you promised yourself to? The skinny, unaccomplished, starving tailor, Muttel Chemsoil. Why would you give up a match with the wealthy Laser Wolf to marry a skinny, unaccomplished, starving tailor? Because, Papa, I love him. To which Tevye, of course, responds with the words of the great Jewish sage Tina Turner, what's love got to do with it? It's just a second-hand emotion. You don't marry for love. You marry because God, community, and parents have made a decision for you. Who are you to promise yourself? Who are you to make this choice? And Tzeitel says, no, Papa, it's a new world. And that launches the beginning of a new world. It's called modernity. And the first symbol of modernity is romantic love as a symbol of autonomy. No longer will God, community, and family tell me how to live my life. I will make my own choices. I will choose for myself. Now that's going to raise an interesting question that Dr. Windmuller is going to raise for us. What do you do with a religious tradition that's phrased entirely in terms of commandments if somebody comes along and says, no, we make our own choices? How do you reconcile that? We'll see that in a minute. The second daughter falls in love with a runaway revolutionary named Perchik. He's running from the Tsar's police in St. Petersburg, where he was caught in the middle of a demonstration, and they're trying to get him to send him to Siberia. So instead, he runs away, and he's hiding in Tevye's hovel, and he becomes part of the family, and he falls in love with the second daughter, who is Tzeitel Huddle, the second daughter, and they run away together. And they represent second thing. Tradition always understood that God is the chief actor in history, but Huddle and Perchik represent a new revolutionary way of thinking of the world. We control history, not God. And why wait till another world to come? Let's bring redemption now. Let's bring redemption now. And so that's the birth of all the great historical movements of socialism, and Bolshevism, and Zionism. into Jewish life. And the third daughter, Chava, is a bookworm. She spends all of her time in the library. The library is attached to the church, and it's there that she meets a little Russian boy named Fyetka, and they fall in love. And that represents a third kind of revolution, which is the opening of the Jewish mind. Up until modernity, we only talk to each other. We never talk to them. And suddenly with modernity, the cognitive doors of modernity open up, and we are now part of a marketplace of ideas. It's really easy when you just talk to yourselves. I remember once we had a Seder, and we had an Egyptian friend come to our Seder. And we're reading that, that part of the Seder where the 10 plagues come? And there's this midrash that says it wasn't 10 plagues, it was 50 plagues. And then we said, no, it's 200 plagues. They said, no, it's 250 plagues. And my poor Egyptian friend said, oh, come on, guys, enough, piling on, But it's easy to say we are the chosen people, the God of the universe, and we are favored and superior morally, as long as you're only talking to yourself. But what happens when you stand in the face of the cognitive universe and all of its claims? This is called modernity. Modernity comes to the Jewish people, as the professor is going to show us now, in the 18th century. And it changes, just about everything. And that's the next revolution in Jewish life. Professor Windmuller, tell us what happened.
Good evening. So it's an extraordinary moment, as Rabbi Feinstein has just reminded us, of what we are about to encounter. The rationalism, the empiricism, the idea of individual choice and the options provided will create for us a revolution of significant magnitude. In part, it is driven by a variety of ideas. Obviously, we're going to be talking tonight about the emergence of Reform Judaism, the growth and presence of conservative Judaism, a variation of traditional or Orthodox Judaism, Reconstructionism, Zionism. This is a moment in which the fertility and diversity of Jewish thought is extraordinary. And while it all does not come at one moment, it all culminates at the end of the 19th and 20th centuries in the context of redefining who we would be and how we would perform in a world that was fundamentally different from anything we had known before. So, we're going to take a look at this by looking at a few slides. And unlike in the past, I'm going to stand in front of the slides because I have to point out certain characteristics that I think we're going to take a look at. And even if you don't see the full slide, the fact is this will all come into play. First of all, this moment, as we've described, of sort of the core elements of the Enlightenment and modernity, those core themes as we've just referenced. Napoleon becomes a key player in much of this. The Declaration of the Rights of Man creates a statement about individuality and democracy and choice and opportunity for people to engage in creating and building a polity, a system of governance that they would have control and participation in. But there was a fundamental question. Who were these elements who were, in a sense, inherited from this medieval moment, from this medieval period? And the Jews were certainly that question. Did they fit the definition of a modern, progressive, engaged human being? And were they more loyal to something called Torah, tradition? Or were they able to articulate a modern version of themselves? As you may recall, in the historical model of what Napoleon does, he assembles the Sanhedrin, or as he would call it, or that would be called the Great National Assembly of Jewish leaders. And these leaders were asked 12 questions. And the questions would, in a sense, be the critical issue of whether Jews would be or not be part of this experiment in modernity. And the questions are posted here. We'll just take a look at a few of them. Is it lawful for Jews to marry more than one wife? Is divorce permitted by the Jewish religion? Can a Jewish marry a Christian or a Christian woman a Jew? Or does the law only allow Jews to marry amongst themselves? Do Jews regard Frenchmen as brethren or strangers? In any case, what duties does their law prescribe to Jews toward Frenchmen who are not of the Jewish religion? Do Jews who were born in France and who have the legal status of French citizens regard France as their fatherland? Is it their duty to defend it, to obey its laws, to accommodate themselves to all the provisions of the civil code? Who nominates rabbis? In addition to each of these questions, the tasks required of the Jewish respondents is to provide a kind of authoritative answer of who we were and how we would frame ourselves, participate in this society. Ultimately, what Napoleon does is to grant freedoms to Jews, but that comes at a price, not only for Jews, but also for France, because it creates a fundamental shift in the storyline of the Jewish people. For the French, it's a question of what the military and the church will react to the decisions made by Napoleon, and to the rest of the European authorities who are aghast at this sudden transformation of the rights and roles of Jews in Western society. So it is not a clean and swift engagement into modernity for Jews. And in fact, some of the restrictions that were released were then reimposed later, both by Napoleon and by others. So this is not a direct road to enlightenment, modernity, and democracy. But it is a major step which ultimately creates the possibilities for further engagement in Europe. We're going to step back for a moment because corresponding to a political figure such as Napoleon were Jewish figures struggling with similar questions, including Moses Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn would be critical in this sort of discovery, if you wish, of who Jews were and how we would redefine ourselves. As a philosopher and a teacher, he saw the questions of the Enlightenment as an opportunity to really reframe the Jewish sort of position. His most important work is a book entitled Jerusalem, published in 1783, toward the end of his life, in which it was an attempt to present Judaism as compatible with all that is happening in this Enlightenment moment, with the ideas of rationalism and humanism. He frames in that context as well the notions that he saw no conflict between the sort of frame of reason and revelation, because he saw reason as confirming a belief in the essence of God, and that divine law would be accepted and understood through reason. Religious tolerance and civil equality were ideas that he championed as a result of the notion that one ought to have the freedom of conscience to be able to define for themselves, including such things as separation of church and state, and advocating for civil equality and tolerance in a modern society. He also understood the importance of religious knowledge, that people needed to know about who they were and what they represented by the way of values out of Judaism, so that the Torah becomes a critical piece to this storyline of not simply dismissing one's past, but embracing it and moving to a new place. Now, Reform Judaism itself is a movement that has its initial framework in Europe, in Germany in particular. And Abraham Geiger, more than any other figure, would be a key player in the framing of Reform Judaism's evolution and development. The whole idea here of taking a tradition and bringing it forward in a context that looked like and in some measure reflected what other religious experiences and expressions were about. Protestantism and its evolving and changing would be a kind of parallel commentary on this moment. So for Geiger, for Jacobson, and for others, it was about helping people to realize that they could be Jewish using the language of their community rather than simply the traditional language of Hebrew, bringing in German as the opportunity to embrace religion through a language that was understood and was now part of the common discourse of Western society. Similarly, the role of music and of seating, the issues associated with how one understood observance, especially in terms of holidays and practice, and the use of prayer books that all reflected this drive to align with the modern world of Europe and the historic sort of themes and values of a great tradition. Now, before we go into the platforms of what has happened and evolved with Reform Judaism, I want to step back and tell you a personal story. I was raised in Richmond, Virginia, in a classical Reform congregation, the sixth oldest in the United States, and my bar mitzvah was on a Sunday, and kippot were not permitted. And the liturgy of that morning service was the Union Prayer Book, which was published in 1940. And it was the sort of tradition of Reform's most classical sort of expression. Was there a Hebrew flag, a State of Israel flag on the bima? No. Was there any reference at any time in this synagogue to Israel? No. Because this was a congregation that was part of the American Council for Judaism. The American Council for Judaism is a name that you may not know, but it said we were Americans first, and that Israel had no place, no role in our identity and in our place of living in an American democratic society. Religion and state were clearly separated. And for Jews in particular, the notion of this question of dual loyalty was strikingly important because they could not and should not be accused of having some loyalty to a foreign state or nation. So that's 1950s. And classical Reform Judaism was in its essence and flourishing as part of this expression. And much of it comes from this first platform, 1885. The Pittsburgh Platform of 1885 was constructed by 12 rabbis, led by Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, the American founder of Reform Judaism, who comes to the United States in the 1840s from Bavaria, and who arrives and serves as a rabbi in Albany, New York. And on Rosh Hashanah of the year 1850, he's in a fistfight with his congregational president, requiring the Albany police to enter the synagogue over the battle over tradition, how much or how little, and what ought to be acceptable in this congregation. Wise leaves the congregation, obviously, takes those who support his reforms, and creates, obviously, a second congregation. He remains in Albany for 4 more years before going to the holy city of Cincinnati, which is exactly the terms used about how the early reformers understood Cincinnati. It would become the centerpiece of the reform movement in North America. The Hebrew Union College, 1885. The formation of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. The formation of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, all of which Wise creates, and all of which become part of the storyline that are ultimately tied to this set of doctrines. Now we're going to look at a few ideas here. I would think that on this sheet, the most important is to indicate the essence of individual sort of sort of the identity of one's own ability to make choices, a kind of reflection that science was important, and that rational thinking about how we live in modern civilizations ought to define our lives. We hold that all such Mosaic and rabbinical laws as regulate diet, priestly purity, and dress, which originated in other ages, are ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. So the first rejection. We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine. But it will get more interesting as we move on. We recognize Judaism as a progressive religion, even striving to be in accord with the postulates of reason. We reject ideas not rooted in Judaism, the beliefs both in bodily resurrection and hell and paradise as abodes for everlasting punishment and reward. We deem it our duty to participate in the great task of modern times to solve on the basis of justice and righteousness the problems presented to our society. We skip now to 1937, the Columbus platform. So we are having a period here of significant numbers of years in which the movement begins to grow and nurture. And what we see is really several movements inside one. The classical reformers are beginning to emerge as key, but there are traditionalists in the movement. And we will see some of that traditionalist perspectives reflected here in 1930s in this document. We will also see geography as being important. The Reform movement, its strength historically has been the Midwest and South. So the rabbis and leaders of congregations in the Midwest, the holy city of Cincinnati, and other places understood that they were the sort of core representatives of a movement that was now being, in a sense, challenged by others from the East Coast. There was no such thing yet as the West Coast. Here in this particular document, Reform recognizes the principle of progressive development in religion, which is an idea that's already circulating in Christianity during the same period. And as a result, it's an idea that moves us forward in understanding, for example, that revelation is a continuous process confined to no one group and to no one age. In other words, the Torah is living, changing, and accordingly we as sort of adherents to this are likewise impacted and reflective of these changes. And here we come. Judaism is the soul of which Israel is the body. Loyalty of Jews who have become estranged from our religious tradition. Now that's very important because Reform was beginning to realize there were a lot of assimilated Jews in this country, early German Jews who had left Judaism to become ethical culturalists, or to frame other forms of non-religious practice, or to even engage with Christianity. So the deep and abiding concern here is about how we bring people back. The other concern here is that our people live, they assume and seek to share loyalty, the full duties and responsibilities of citizenship to create seats of Jewish knowledge and religion. What we are beginning to see here is what we will study in a few minutes with Rabbi Feinstein, some of the themes of Judaism as a civilization, of Mordecai Kaplan's ideas of reconstructing Jewish thought, and we begin to see some of that expressed here. And reminding ourselves that Palestine was not acceptable in the first platform. Here in 1937, in a moment in time when what is happening in Europe with the rise of Hitler, we begin to see in the rehabilitation of Palestine, the land hallowed by memories and hopes, we hold the promise of renewed life for many of our brethren. We affirm the obligation of all Jewry to aid in its upbuilding as a Jewish homeland by endeavoring to make it not only a haven of refuge, for the oppressed, but also a center of Jewish culture and spiritual life. So this did not sit well with huge segments of the movement, but it was, in fact, the movement's position beginning in 37. And there are other issues, because what we know in Reform Judaism was the concept of justice as being a powerful motif in the movement, and it is reflected very strongly here in this categorization, and also here the spiritual and physical disarmament of all nations. Because there was a movement, not only in Judaism, but amongst others, about military disarmament in this moment, saying, avoid war. Let's not embrace Nazism and let's not engage in conflict. And so this is a reflection of some of that effort, which we will see again with Vietnam and the Reform movement, and we will see again in other settings in which this pullback from teaching about violence or the abhorrence of violence becomes a central theme. And I think here in this particular part of the context, Judaism as a way of life. Now this is a very different model from the earlier platform, because here it addresses the interesting question that Judaism is more than just possibly a religion, but has customs and symbols and ceremonies and cultivates a distinctive form of religious art and music and the use of Hebrew. Wow. Are Jews, the Reform movement folks coming back into tradition? We'll see. So we come to San Francisco, 1976. 1976, it's the American Centennial. And it's important for the movement to show that it too is taking a centenary perspective of its position and place. And so here again, there are some key themes associated with. This will be the first platform that will refer in any consequence to what has happened in the 1940s. It references the Shoah for the first time. It will be a platform that will speak to questions of the notion of progress and the idea of accomplishments and the aspirations of Jews. So it has a kind of uplifting character to it. It is the only one of the platforms that sort of addresses something that is aspirational as against simply sort of a construct of sort of ideas and practice. So at this point, I'm going to sort of take a pause because I want to intersect here, and Rabbi Feinstein will provide for us a perspective of those who respond to all of this. If this is a movement that has gained traction and has created a momentum of its own, even as it has gone through these different stages of reflections on Israel, on practice, on Hebrew, on ceremony and culture. But in reality, it is a movement that raises certain challenges to the rest of the Jewish world.
Can you address why the New York Times has been a consistent enemy of Israel from the late 1930s, based on Sulzberger's classical reform?
Next time. We're going to do Zionism next time. Zionism and its enemies will be next time. Is that okay, Michael? That means you got to come back. You got to come back. You got to come back. So I want to just step back just a little and go back over some of the stuff that Steve went over so we can catch up with a different perspective. This is a meeting place of philosophical ideas, practical politics, and the practice of religion. No, leave the screen. Leave the screen on. We got a lot more. Philosophical ideas, practical politics, the practice of religion. Okay, you ready? So the end of the 18th century, the 1700s, we have an idea that is beginning to rise in, actually, the 1600s, the end of the 1600s, but through the 1700s, we have an idea that's rising through Europe. It's called Enlightenment. Enlightenment said the following. Enlightenment said, feudal medieval life was governed by the words of Scripture, by the words of the Bible. and the authority of the church. But why should I, as a thinking person, accept the authority of the church? People like Erasmus rises up in the 1600s, rises up against the authority of the church and says, who says? Why do I have to listen to you? Why do you get to tell me what to believe and what to do? I can investigate these things. And you'll see, by the way, that there's a correspondence between that Enlightenment idea and the empiricism, that is, go look at the truth, right? And the beginning of science, Isaac Newton, and empirical science. The idea of the Enlightenment, which threw off the authority of the church, began to say, here's a new idea. Here's a new idea. A different idea of who people are. Human beings are individuals. Human beings are born with reason. And through reason, we shape societies of reason. And that's the great Enlightenment idea. One of the greatest expressions of the Enlightenment, I don't know how many of you are watching Ken Burns' new series, The American Revolution, but the American Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson was an empiricist, that is, he was a scientist. He was looking at the world, studying the world as it was. He was a thinker, and he had absorbed the ideas of European Enlightenment. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, there is absolutely nothing self-evident in that sentence. That wasn't self-evident at all. In fact, for most of human history, those were not true. But in fact, what he was trying to say is it's a new age and a new time. And that idea that all men are created equal, remarkable idea. Now, what happened? The question, however, was, what about these Jews? What do we do with them? Are they to be included in the category of men and therefore to be considered equal? Or are they a special class of men? If you listen to Ken Burns, you realize that all men are created equal included only what? White, land-owning, middle-aged, rich men. That left out an awful lot of people. But nevertheless, that was, the guy who wrote that owned slaves. Just keep that in mind. So the question was, how do you reconcile that with this population of Jews in the world? Now let's step away from Enlightenment for a minute, look at practical politics. The medieval state was a corporate state. That is, you had different, what they call estates. You had the king, you had the nobility, you had the trade guilds, you had the church, and over here you had a group of people called the Jews. It wasn't that individuals were citizens of a land. Your corporation, your group was a citizen of the land. The nobility belonged to the land, belonged to the land and paid taxes to the king. The church belonged to the land and paid taxes to the king. The guilds belonged to the land. The Jews belonged to the land. Everybody got that? Now the question is, comes the middle of the 19th century, or the 18th century, sorry, and we begin to have a new organization. The Enlightenment starts to affect the way people think about countries. And instead of thinking of myself as a member of a guild or the church or the nobility, the idea of I am a citizen. I individually belong to a land. Well, the nobility belong because they're nobility. And the church belongs because they're the church, except there was an interesting problem with Catholicism, because if your king said one thing and your pope said something other, Gewalt, okay? That's the reason why Henry VIII decided to pull away from the church. Not only did he want to get divorced from Catherine of Aragon, but he wanted to create a new political organization where the king would be both the civil leader, the king, and the head of the Church of England. King Charles II, our friend Charles, is the head of state and the head of the church. Get it? But that way you swear loyalty to him individually as a citizen. That's the second idea. Well, here's another idea. We Americans have a peculiar idea about what it means to be an American. Some of us were born here, some of us immigrated here, some of us became citizens of this country. We have different ideas about this country. In Europe, it's different. I was in Germany. I was invited to a conference in Germany shortly after the Berlin Wall fell. And it happened to be, quite by accident, that there was a huge demonstration going on in Berlin near my hotel, calling for justice for Turkish foreign workers in Germany. After the Second World War, there were no men in Germany. They'd all gotten killed. And they needed men to man the factories. So they brought in Turkish workers, and they brought in Pakistani workers. And by 1991, there were people who were third generation, living in Germany, born in Germany, spoke German, went to German schools, but were ethnic Pakistanis and ethnic Turks. And they were not citizens of Germany. Because to be a citizen of Germany, you have to be German. To be a citizen of Italy, you have to be Italian. To be a citizen of France, you have to be French. And these people were of a different nationality, but they're living in the land. That's why it's different than America, because in America we don't have this idea, right? But in Germany, they did have this idea, as they did in most European countries. So here's my problem, Napoleon's problem. You're a Jew who's born here. Are you a Frenchman who happens to practice a Jewish religion? Or are you a Jew by nationality who happens to live in France and speak French and eat baguette? What do we do with you? Do we accept you as a citizen and make you part of our land? Or do we say you belong sort of as an outsider, maybe a resident alien, but not part of us? Did everybody see the problem? All right, so what happens? The Enlightenment won. Napoleon said, come out wherever you are. Jews are now citizens. Jews are now equal in all their rights. Jews do not have to live in a Jewish ghetto in a neighborhood. Jews are not restricted from professions. Jews are no longer restricted from education. Jews are no longer restricted in any way. Jews can be sued in court and can sue in our courts. You are a full citizen of France, Mazel Tov. Guess what we did? Guess what Jews did in France, in Germany, in the Czech Republic, in Italy, in England, in America? We left our ghettos as fast as we could get the hell out of there. We took off our Jewish clothes, shaved off our beards, threw away our yarmulkes, started speaking the language of the land, and became French, Italian, German, English, American. We began assimilating as quickly as possible into the outside culture. Everybody got that? You following me? Right? Now, that offered some problems for some people, which we will talk about next time. It's part of Michael's wonderful question, which is, if I'm a German nationalist, and I believe in the purity of the fatherland, and there are these people, and they're not like us, and we've given them political equality and civil rights, but it's clear that they're not really German. What do I do with them? And that's going to be the birth of what's called modern anti-Semitism. We'll come to that next time. That's going to be our topic in the next session. But let's come back to our source. What do we do? What do you do if you're the leader of a German community in the middle of the 1800s, middle of the 19th century, and you're watching the youth of your congregation leave the ghetto, shave their beards, throw away their yarmulkes, give up Shabbat, give up dietary laws, kosherus, give up prayer, give up Jewish customs, go to universities, buy businesses, become fully equal to Germans, and be very proud that they're German. In fact, you know, because you Jews are so devious. You not only were German, you were uber German. You were more German than the Germans. You were so adamant about proving that you belonged, that you spoke beautiful German. And you did everything to show the world that you were more German than the German, more French than the French, more Italian than the Italian. And what if I'm your rabbi? What do I say to you? What do I say to you? If I say to you, come back into the ghetto and live a Jewish life, you're going to laugh at me, right? But what if I do this? What if I tell you, I'll make you a deal. I will make the synagogue a German place of worship. In 1840, the synagogue in Hamburg put in an organ. An organ. Why? Because churches had organs. And if I ever invite my neighbors to a bar mitzvah, I want my synagogue to look like their church, so it's respectable. So they put in an organ. Remember we talked about the rabbi that got into a fist fight? There was a huge fight in that synagogue. There was music in the air. There's a huge fight on that synagogue. And that really was sort of the beginning of Reform Judaism. Before you get to these beautiful words, it was a question of aesthetics. How do we dress? What language does the rabbi talk? In what way does the synagogue present itself? In what way does Judaism present itself? Suppose I can make the following claim. We Jews are not a nationality. So you Germans don't have to be afraid of us. We Jews are not a nationality. So you French don't have to be afraid of us. We are French who happen to practice the Jewish faith. After all, most French people are Catholic. Some French people are Huguenot, they're Protestant. There are a few French of other faiths. So we're French of the Jewish faith. We're German of the Jewish faith. In other words, what would I lose if I take Judaism and I smush it down into the box called religion? Footnote. There's no word for religion in Hebrew. There's no word for religion in the Bible. There's no word for religion in the Talmud. There's no word for religion in any Jewish source. You know why? Because that concept didn't exist in our faith. It was just the way we Jews lived. But modernity gave us this box called religion, which is one part of your life. So what if I took my Judaism and I stuck it in the box called religion, and then I can turn to my non-Jewish neighbors and say, well, you're a Catholic and you're a Protestant, right? And I'm a Jew. Well, that sounds reasonable. We could all be French, Italian, German, eventually American, who practice this faith. But for a moment, what do I lose? If I smush down my religion into religion, and I give up all of the national, cultural, ethnic affectations, gestures, expressions of my Jewish identity, and I make myself into a German of the Jewish persuasion. Everybody got this? What will my synagogue look like? What will prayer sound like? What will a Jewish home look like if I'm a German or an Austrian or Swiss or Italian or American of the Jewish persuasion? And what will I lose? And what will I lose? And that is where Reform Judaism begins. The Reform rabbis said, look, it's nice keeping kosher, but it's not really necessary. You can be a very good Jew without that. And you can be a very good Jew without the tzitzit, the strings hanging down from your shirt. And you can even be a good Jew without the yarmulke. Because the essence, hear that word? Essence of Judaism is a belief in one God, the ethics of our faith, a persistent work toward justice, an outlook of brotherhood in the world, a vision of a world made one. The essence of our faith is not affected by giving up all these ethnic affectations and gestures and expressions. The essence is preserved. And particularly in a moment when so many young people are ditching or leaving, the essence is preserved. So first I'm going to change myself, my identity, and I'm going to change my synagogue, and I'm going to change the institutions of my community, because my community now is Germany, or Italy, or Switzerland, or France, or whatever I decide it's going to be, but it's not a Jewish community anymore. That becomes my identity. Does that clear? And that really is the impetus for this thing. That's what these platforms are. That's where they started. Everybody got that? That's where they started. Now, there was a backlash. I want to tell you about two aspects of the backlash that I'm not going to talk about. The one was people who said, this is nonsense. Torah is Torah, God is God, Jews are Jews, Jews are not German, Jews are not French, Jews are not Americans. To hell with you, we want nothing to do with you. You might know some people like this. They rejected the whole project of enlightenment and emancipation and joining Europe. They're over here. We'll call them the far right. Sometimes we call them ultra something or other. Okay? They're the ones who say, I want nothing to do with this. It's all poison. And there are people. There was a very famous Hungarian rabbi named the Khatam Sofer. And the Khatam Sofer said, nothing new can ever be admitted into Judaism. Now, you have a movement called Reform. Define Reform, new. What did the Khatam Sofer say? Nothing new. If Moses didn't do it, I ain't doing it. Get it? That's one ultra. There was ultra on the other side that said, what do I need Judaism for anymore? I'm a German. I love Germany. I love German culture, German language, German literature, German music, even German food. Yuck. Right? Beer's good. Right? I don't need this Jewish stuff. Give it all up and become a Lutheran. That's the ultra, let's call it left. They wanted nothing to do with Judaism. What we're interested in is all of us in the middle, who said, you know, there's so much in this modern world that is remarkable, but you know what? I still have a feel of a tie to my Jewishness. I have a connection to my Jewishness. How do I live both? Got that? How do I live both? How do I live both a loyalty to my faith, my tradition, and a loyalty to the culture of modernity in which I exist every day, which I find a great deal of goodness in? And that becomes the great question. Reform Judaism was the first effort to do this. We like to think of Orthodoxy as older. No. Orthodoxy came as a response to this. As a response to this. Best example was here in America, in Baltimore. Wouldn't you know it? In Baltimore, the same guys that put the organ in 1840 in the synagogue of Hamburg moved to Baltimore, and guess what they did there? One Shabbos, they uncovered their brand new organ. You know what happened? The board of directors split, and one side sued the other. The case went to the United States Supreme Court. You Jews, you don't know how to stop, do you? And ultimately, the Supreme Court said, what are you doing here? Go home and figure this out. So they split into multiple communities. But this idea of, I want to be in the middle, as opposed to you've gone too far in the middle. Because once you're in the middle, it's all a question of degrees. This is what happens. So Reform Judaism is the first expression of an attempt to try to live both modernity and tradition at the same time by defining what's the essence of Judaism and then saying we're going to throw away everything else. Everybody got that? But now right away you can see what's going to happen here, and that's what Steve has just shown us, which is that question of what do I need to throw away and what do I want to keep changes depending on what my attitude is about the outside culture. If I'm crazy in love with Germany of the 1840s, I'm going to define a pretty radical reform. If I'm crazy in love with America in the 1870s, that's what I'm going to define as reform. By 1937, we weren't so crazy in love with America. We loved America, but remember, in the middle of the Depression, there were all kinds of questions about what America was. And by 1976, some of you remember that year, there was some serious questions about America. Remember, the Vietnam War ended in 1975 with a tragic end. By 1976, we were asking some very deep questions about just how valuable is this American project, and what can Judaism do to shine a light on it? That's why these platforms kept changing. Clear? But now let's watch. Go back to Germany with me in the 1800s, and I want to introduce you to a great hero of Jewish life named Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. He's a rabbi, I think it's Hamburg is where he started, and then he moves to Berlin. And he becomes the spokesman for a new movement that is the response to reform. And it's called Modern Orthodox. Now think of that name for a minute, for just a minute. Just consider the name. So one guy says, I'm a Jew of the Reform Party, meaning I want to change things so that I bring them up to date and in congruence with the culture I live in. And the other guy comes forward and says, no. I'm Orthodox. I want to do it the right way, but I'm modern Orthodox, which means I think that I can square my orthodoxy with a lifestyle that puts me right in the middle of modernity. And that's what Shimshon Raphael Hirsch organized. And the first thing he said was, you call us Orthodox Jews, huh? In point of fact, it was not Orthodox Jews who introduced the word Orthodox into the Jewish discussion. It was a modern progressive Jew, Reform Jews, who applied the name to old backward Jews as a derogatory term. And we resented it, and rightly so, because Orthodox Jews don't know different kinds of Jews. We only know Jews. We only know Judaism and non-Judaism. Make up your mind. That's the first thing. So what they did is they took which is very common, by the way, in Jewish culture and other cultures, they took what was once a derogatory term and turned it into a badge of honor. Who are we? We are the good Jews. That's what he meant. We are the righteous Jews. We are the faithful Jews, as opposed to you, Reform Jews. I don't know how many of you have Orthodox relatives, but they haven't given this argument up, right? By the way, a modern parallel to the same thing is in Israel. Remember I told you about the very, very right-wing, I don't want anything to do with the modern world kind of Judaism? In Israel, they were once called, as a derogatory term, Haredi, which means extremists. You know what they did? They made that a badge of honor. We are Haredi. We are more Jewish than you'll ever be. Mazel tov, right? That's what, it became a badge of honor. So what does he say? The great motto of German Reform Judaism in the 1840s and 1850s was, religion allied to progress. And Shimshon Raphael Hirsch says, well, what the heck does that mean? What is this progress? In the expression religion allied to progress, progress is evidently intended to qualify religion. Indeed, this is the essence of the idea, not religion itself, but religion only to the extent that it can coexist with progress. You're going to change religion to come into congruence, to come into faithfulness with progress. But wait a minute. The subordination of religion to any other factor is a denial of religion. Admit it. It's not that you're trying to make Judaism progress. You just don't want to keep kosher anymore because you don't want to keep kosher. Because you want to eat all kinds of stuff with your non-Jewish neighbors. Admit it. You're giving it up. You're not changing it, he said. Right? How dare you place another law above it? It's, after all, God and his law. If the Torah is God's and this is God's law, how can you modify it? Who the hell are you? Get it? He said, so at least admit what you're doing. And then he's a full-on attack. A full-on attack. I don't know how many of you have frum relatives, but I've heard this many times already. Religion allied to progress. You know what, dear reader, that means? Virtue allied to sensual enjoyment. Rectitude allied to advancement. Uprightness allied to success. It means a religion and morality which can be preached also in the haunts of vice and iniquity. In other words, what you're doing is destroying the essence of our faith. Why don't you just admit it? You just don't want to be Jewish anymore. Or at least you don't want to be a faithful Jew anymore. You can read this on your own and you'll get angry. He said, what do we want? And here's going to be Shimshon Raphael Hirsch's idea, right? Are these the only alternatives? Either to abandon religion or renounce all progress with which the glorious and noble gifts of civilization have offered mankind? I mean, are we even going to have to just choose one of these ultras on either side? He says, no. Is Jewish religion really of such a nature that its faithful adherents must be enemies of civilization and progress? We declare before heaven and earth that if our religion demanded that we should give it up, we would give it up, but that's not what religion demands, right? That's not what religion demands. If you go all the way down, right? Thank goodness, even now our sons and daughters compare favorably in cultural moral worth, right? If you go to the end of it, Judaism that's come down from our forefathers is a gift of the Word of God, is an ideal given to the generation of the house of Jacob. Shimshon Raphael Hirsch's idea was, look, I can be a fully observant Orthodox Jew and live fully in the world of modernity. And it's very simple. In all the areas that Jewish tradition tells me I have to do, keeping kosher, making Shabbos, giving tzedakah, praying to God, wearing a kippah, I can do that. And I can also be a doctor and learn science and practice medicine in a modern hospital. I can also be a lawyer and learn law and practice law in the courts of the country. I can be a professor and teach anything I want to. I can be fully engaged in a life in modernity because nothing in the Jewish tradition prevents me from doing that. And I don't have to shun modernity because I know in my heart that I maintain my Jewishness to the fullest extent possible. And so what he offered is what we call modern Orthodox. Modern Orthodox are Jews who are fully engaged in Jewish life and yet at the same time fully engaged in modernity. If you've been to Dodger Stadium and you go to the back of the right field bleachers, there is Jeff's Kosher Sausage. And for $18, Gewalt, you can get yourself a kosher hot dog and a beer for another $18 and enjoy the game, right? And during the seventh inning stretch, there is a Mincha Mariv minyan on the Lodge deck. So if you happen to want to daven Mincha Mariv and pray for Shohei Ohtani to hit another home run, or say Kaddish for a loved one, you can do that. Now think about what that means. How fully engaged in modernity are you? You're at Dodger Stadium watching a game. How fully engaged as a Jew you are? You're wearing a cap over your kippah, and you're eating a kosher hot dog and a cold beer. Mazel tov. You are Shimshon Raphael Hirsch's dream. Modern Orthodoxy was born. Yeshiva University in New York City, right? Washington Heights. Yeshiva University, you take 10 courses a semester, 5 courses in like any other university, English, social sciences, humanities, science, natural sciences, and 5 courses in Jewish studies. You take a parallel curriculum. It's called Torah Umada, Torah and science. That's modern Orthodoxy. Get it? But notice what happens there. 5 courses in modern learning and 5 courses in Jewish studies at the same time, but they don't touch each other. So the scientist who is Jewish, the doctor who is Jewish, bases his or her, let's say, biological sciences on a paradigm of human evolution, but when I open the Torah, evolution isn't there. The world is created by God. Now, I can play all kinds of games to reconcile those two, but I don't. 5 and 5, they have nothing to do with each other. That's how I do it. My Shabbos observance and my civil participation don't touch each other. I have a cousin who's an Orthodox rabbi in Brooklyn, and he and I have this argument again and again and again. And at one point, I got mad at him, and I said, Ronnie, your daughter applies to medical school. Is she going to go to medical school? Oh, of course, she's a brilliant kid, and she wants to become a doctor. Great, wonderful. Right. Ronnie, she's a woman. She can't have an aliyah in your synagogue. She can't read Torah in your synagogue. She can't lead a prayer in your synagogue. She can't even sing in your synagogue because women's voices are not permitted. She sits in the back, way in the back, covered by a screen. That's a mechitza. How is it that she is not permitted to sing in your synagogue, to speak in your synagogue, to teach in your synagogue, to pray in your synagogue, but she's permitted to perform brain surgery? And he'd say, because one is God's law and God's domain, and the other is secular. And he's okay with that. Me, I go out of my mind. Why? Because I'm not an Orthodox Jew. Okay? Look at the next guy. Solomon Schechter. Solomon Schechter was a Romanian yeshiva Jew, actually a rabbi, brilliant scholar of Torah from Romania, who was recruited by Cambridge University to become the professor of Jewish studies at Cambridge, and taught Bible and Talmud, basically, at Cambridge University. He had many important discoveries, and then was brought to the United States to be the president of my alma mater, the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and becomes one of the founders of conservative Judaism. Solomon Schechter said, and what would happen if we let modernity talk to Judaism, and Judaism talk to modernity? What would Judaism learn from modernity, and what would modernity learn from Judaism? Here are 2 of his statements. What we really object to, we don't object to authority. What we really object to is weak authority, phonograph-like authority, which is always busy in reproducing the voices of others without an opinion of its own, without originality, initiative, and discretion. The real authorities are those who, drawing from the inspiration from the past, also understand how to reconcile us with the present and prepare us for a future. And here's his program in a word. It is not mere revealed Bible, which is first importance to the Jew, but the Bible that repeats itself in history, in other words, as it is interpreted by tradition. Translation. We don't read Torah. We read Torah as it's understood in our moment of history. And every moment of history, because we know things that our ancestors didn't know, is going to read Torah differently. And so, we need to interpret Torah according to the way we understand the world today. The most radical expression of this, somebody you know and I know very, very well, my dear wife. My dear wife was the first woman admitted to the rabbinical school of the Jewish Theological Seminary. All through the late 1970s, there was an argument, can we ordain a woman as a rabbi? The argument against it was, the principal argument against it was, you can't because we never did before. I'm not kidding, that was the argument. You can't because we never did before. And the argument for it was, you have all these brilliant, sensitive, spiritual, deep, talented, wonderful young women who want to become the great teachers of Torah in the community, and just because you never had the brains to do it before, or the vision to do it before, or the courage to do it before, you're not going to do it now. And there was a 10-year fight, and we were there for it. And Nina had a hard time. And finally, in 1984, enough of the old guys had died that the young guys took over and said, you know, we have to come into the 20th century. Hell, we had to come into the 19th century and ordain women. And we get a call. We were living in Texas at the time. And the dean of the rabbinical school, Gordon, said to Nina, send me the application. You're going to be the first one in the school. And she's the first one. What did that mean? It's not that previous generations hated women. They just saw women in a different role. But by the middle of the 1980s, it was clear that women had new roles in society and they were ready to be ordained as rabbis. That's quintessential Solomon Schechter. Quintessential, a new kind of Judaism which says we feel the tug of tradition, but we are also loyal to modernity, and we're going to let the two talk to each other, and that's called conservative Judaism. Everybody got that? Right? So you're sitting in a conservative synagogue. No mechitza. Thank God, right? Women rabbis. Gay people welcome. Torah read in Hebrew, davening in Hebrew, right? A rabbi who slips a lot of Yiddish words into his vocabulary, mazel tov, right? But a synagogue fully conversant with modernity. Fully conversant with modernity. That's conservative Judaism, okay? Now, third one, really quick, because I want to let Steve finish. There was an outgrowth of conservative Judaism led by a great scholar named Mordechai Kaplan. And Kaplan was working in the 1930s when huge numbers of young American Jews were defecting. And he understood this same impulse to bring Judaism into modernity, to make the two talk to each other. And he had a different idea. He said, really, what is it we want most of all? We have all kinds of questions about the Torah and all kinds of problems with God, but none of us have a problem being proud to be Jews. So let's make that the core of our Judaism. Quickly, here's Kaplan. This is his work, Judaism as a Civilization, in 1934. Before the beginning of the 19th century, all Jews regarded Judaism as a privilege. Since then, most Jews have come to regard it as a burden. Just give you a quick background, okay? It's all has to do with 3 blocks in New York City, okay? The great Reform rabbi, the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel, which is the biggest synagogue in the universe, at least this side of the universe, was a man named Samuel Adler, great Reform thinker. His son was a brilliant young philosopher named Felix Adler. Samuel Adler offered us this, what Steve called classical reform. His son Felix Adler said, let's take the essence of Judaism and get rid of all the Jewish stuff. And he started and he started an organization called the Society for Ethical Culture. And he moved across Central Park. Temple Emmanuel is on 5th Avenue and 69th Street. He moved across Central Park to the corner of 5th Avenue and 85th Street, and he built a beautiful temple called the Society for the Advancement of Ethical Culture. And it was mostly second-generation American Jews whose parents were Orthodox, and weren't willing to give it up altogether, but didn't need any of this ritual stuff. And so they had a philosophical society, talk about ethical stuff. And that, by the way, it's still there, as a wonderful high school. Mordecai Kaplan comes along and says, that's what I'm talking about. People who think of their Judaism as a burden to be thrown off. I want to bring them back. So what do? Reconstructionism. What happened? Where did he get that name from? There was a for Reconstruction, was the movement after the Civil War. But most of all, it was his teacher, John Dewey, at Columbia University, wrote a very famous book called Reconstruction in Philosophy. And what he meant was, let's just build a philosophy on common experience. Get rid of all this highfalutin language. What do we know about the world from being in the world? And so Kaplan said, what do we know about Judaism being in the world? Reconstruction is a movement to revitalize Judaism, to win back those Jews who went to ethical culture, not those who went to the Lutheran Church. You're not going to get those back. But the ethical culture people you could win back. Why? It does to Judaism what Copernicus did to astronomy. It shifts the center of gravity of Jewish life from Jewish religion to Jewish peoplehood. In formulating a modern scientific ideology based on the assumption that Judaism is an evolving religious civilization, Reconstructionism is habituating Jewish life to the scientific claims and opinions of our day. Most of us, without you even knowing it, grew up as Reconstructionist Jews. Because most of us were raised in synagogue communities, if we were raised in synagogue communities, where they didn't talk much about God, and they didn't talk much about commandments as voice of God. What they talked about was the Jewish people, Jewish education, Jewish families, intermarriage as an issue, as a problem, Israel these are statements of Jewish peoplehood, not necessarily Jewish religion. And this was Mordecai Kaplan's attempt to try to find a place in the middle that would integrate both our citizenship and modernity and our adherence to Judaism. And that's the great Jewish problem of modernity. I'm going to turn it back to Steve now to finish. Go ahead. You have questions? Oh my God, how can you possibly have questions? That was so crystal clear. Rabbi Schulweis was one of the principal students of Mordecai Kaplan, except he was even more radical than Mordecai Kaplan in many, many ways. And one of the things that I haven't talked about, that we will talk about next time, because one of the things that affected Rabbi Schulweis, which did not affect Rabbi Kaplan, was the reality of the Holocaust. Rabbi Kaplan was born in the 1880s and inherited from the 19th century this idea that everything is progressively getting better and better and better and better. Right? There's a Beatles song like that. I got to admit it's getting better. That's a 19th century philosophy of progress. John Dewey, who was Mordecai Kaplan's teacher, believed in that. And we believed in that. Everybody believed in progress until the Holocaust came and said, maybe not. Maybe there's still a dark side to human nature, to human beings. Maybe there's still a quality of evil in the world that makes progress really hard to believe in. And then that sort of shattered much of Mordecai Kaplan's vision and gave us someone like Schulweis, who had a very more radical and different vision. We'll take a look at that next time, okay?
Because Rabbi Schulweis talked about
All the time, because it was his teacher. It was his teacher. David.
Everything that I've heard tonight sounds like Jews trying to be accepted, not as part of the
Yes.
overall world,
Number-
instead of what they experienced prior to that, of being ostracized, being villainized,
Because Napoleon offered them what was called the Emancipation Bargain. What was the Emancipation Bargain? We will accept you. We will let you out of the ghetto. We will give you equality. We will give you access to education, to business, to social advancement, to social position, even to political power. We will accept you and make you equal to us if you give up all this stuff that's distinctive and makes you different from us. How much of you are you willing to give up to buy acceptance? And what happens? And there's a sort of, You know what the Copenhagen syndrome is? When the prisoner begins to identify with the jailer? Stockholm, yeah, that's the one. Copenhagen's just next door to Stockholm. It's the more feverish version. Because what happens? If I'm oppressed, and pretty soon I start believing what my oppressors are telling me, that I am inferior, that I am wrong, that I am strange, that I'm not right, And then someone comes along and says, okay, you can be right. I'll make you right. All you got to do is give up what's different about you. Give up what's different about you. So Herschel Fox, my dear, dear friend and teacher, has 500 jokes about this, right? Right? Do you remember the Jew who's finally, after 100 applications and thousands of dollars of donations, accepted to the country club? Right? To the restricted country club? And he stands in front of all the friends and he says, I'm so wondering, for his membership initiation, and he says, oh, my fellow Goyim. Right? Or the other one, the computer from the Federation, the computer from the fundraising Federation kicks out a name, so they go up to the guy's mansion, this beautiful mansion, and the butler puts him in the library and says, the master will be with you in a moment. You know, and the master comes out in his smoking jacket and his ascot with a sniff of brandy, and he says, gentlemen, I'm so very sorry. I regret to inform you that your computer is wrong. I am not of the Jewish faith. Well, it never is wrong. It always tells us the right. I'm sorry, gentlemen. I am as Episcopalian as it gets, let me tell you. It never is wrong. Listen, gentlemen, let me tell you. My name is Thurgood Montgomery IV. I am not of the Jewish faith. And neither was my father, Oliver Shalom, Thurgood Montgomery III. I mean, this idea of trying to be what I'm not and trying to reconcile who I want to be with what I am and what I could be. And you're exactly right. It is a question of acceptance, but more than acceptance, it's a question of psychological wholeness. And also acceptance, a question of ideology. When I was 6 years old, my mom said, we're 7 years old, we're going to the school at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I said, what for? She'll say, you'll see. And we went to the public school, and around the public school yard were all of my classmates and all the kids in the school. We all waited in line until we got to the nurse, and the nurse gave us, not a shot, a sugar cube coated with this orange goo. And my mother said, eat it. And I said, why? She said, just eat it. Put it in your mouth, quick. And I put it in my mouth, and it was fine, and she started to cry. My mother said, my whole life I could never go swimming in the summer. My whole life I was terrified because polio took the best of us, including the President of the United States. You will never, ever get polio. That was the Salk vaccine, or the Sabin vaccine. Yeah, the Sabin vaccine. Now, that's modernity. That's not Judaism. That's modernity. Modernity has in it things that are sacred. So how do I reconcile my Judaism and my modernity if I don't want to reject modernity? Because there are things there that are incredibly valuable. My friend Moshe is one of the leading pediatric doctors in the world. He's cured diseases using science which isn't Judaism. And yet he does it out of a Jewish ethic of pikuach nefesh. I'm going to compliment you because you're my friend. I can pick on you, it's okay. You know, pediatric infectious diseases, except it's pikuach nefesh. So how do I use the tools of modernity and the ideas of modernity and the ethics of Judaism and live them at the same time? That's the great struggle of reform, conservative, orthodoxy, reconstructionist Judaism today. Steve. Where is the clicker? Where is the... We have luck right there. Is that right there? No, it's not it? No. No. Well, here it is. Huh? It's like finding the yacht. You can't read it without the yacht. Right.
So we're going to skip some of this, and we're going to go up to 1997. And so reform has this issue of how to deal with Israel and the negotiating of the place of Reform Judaism within Israel, and that for the Masorti or conservative movement as well. Are we accepted, and what role should we play, and how deeply are we committed to Zionism, especially recalling the history of this movement with its unevenness in terms of Israel? and therefore a very deep embracing of the Israel agenda and the case for Jewish involvement with Israel and for Reform Jews to be connected to the state and to the idea and to the dream of Zionism. So these are all the specific sort of expectations for Aliyah and for support for Reform Judaism's expressions inside Israel as well. Then we come to 1999. Now that's seemingly we're getting platforms much more quickly. But part of that is who's behind each of these. The senior rabbi of Stephen Wise Free Temple in New York, now Rabbi Ami Hirsch, who's deeply involved in Zionism and has credentials both family-wise and movement-wise with Israel, was the architect of the 96 platform. This one is, the architect here is Rabbi Richard Levy of blessed memory. And some of you know and have studied with Richard when he was active in the community at Hillel and at the Hebrew Union College. And Richard was president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, but was very committed to the notion of bringing reform back into tradition. In other words, finding avenues by which Reform Jews would be comfortable and accommodating and engaged with the practices of Judaism. The Hebrew language, the notions of even kashrut, the principles of study. And the document was originally designed by Richard, and then it was pushed back by many who said this is going too far. So what it becomes is a kind of construct of diverse views, similar to what we've heard and seen elsewhere in the sort of battle of where and how we fit all of these competing ideas. So it's a beautiful document dealing with God, Torah, and Judaism as a embodiment of the collective community. The principles behind it are to really create this sense that reform is not somehow out and away from the central play within American Jewish life, but was coming into conversation with other movements and other groups. And it was coming at a time in which the movement was beginning to feel some of its challenges. And there are 5 challenges that movements such as this go through. Generational changes, and younger generations saying, this is not my Judaism, even if they grew up in those movements, but finding that the movements were no longer speaking to them. The staleness of worship and liturgy. How many Debbie Friedman songs can one sing? The notions of the guitar, and whether the guitar was of a particular moment in time and whether it should be replaced or removed. The growth of spirituality and this desire of people to be involved spiritually with Judaism and not necessarily through the discourse of religious practice and worship. And the consistent challenges associated with the costs of Jewish living and the issues surrounding relationships with Israel and the controversies and debates over Zionism and what it was and what it should become and how it should be interpreted. All of these become very important and very significant. So what we get in the 21st century is the impact of the economic recession in 2008 and the pandemic in 2021. And those are profoundly important to American Judaism in ways that we are still uncovering in terms of the downsizing of certain congregations, the mergers of others, the changes in the sort of expectations of where these movements are going, and the behaviors of Jews who are sitting at home watching Park Avenue Synagogue as a virtual experience, or Central Synagogue, or any number of other opportunities to sort of become removed from being in place to having the place come within their lives and homes. and the generational issues, the vast challenges about transmitting these traditions, these practices, these loyalties to movement, and looking at the demographics of what all of that is telling us, and the impact of technologies in all different ways. The rise of what some of us are writing about called privatized Judaism, where people are simply studying Judaism on their own, not needing a rabbi, not needing a community, electing to actually create religious expression and participation through the vehicles of self-study and small communities and startup communities and boutique Judaism. And of course, all of the other ways by which Jewish life has become much more sort of diversified. Inside the Reform movement, there was a revolt in 2012. It was the revolt of the 18 largest Reform congregations. It's basically saying, this is not working. You have a seminary, a conference, and a union, and they should be merged. You have a movement that is not gaining traction in Israel. You have a movement that is not in conversation with other groups and constituencies. You have a movement losing members. And so the revolt, which never really went anywhere, however, has stimulated a huge number of responses. A think tank in the period of 2012 to 2014 to bring the college, the conference, and the union together to think about the future of reform. The recommendations provided in that think tank, not one of them was ever accepted. And they were very interesting collection of ideas about talking about really rethinking the place of religion and reform in particular in its context. And now what is happening is a group that has merged yet again, and it's going to hold its third conference this May in New York called Recharging Reform Judaism. And this runs outside of the movement. This is not run by the union, the college, or the conference, but these are renegades. Folks who are basically saying, you're not talking the language, the culture, and the expression of 21st century Jewish life that we need to think about. Now, this is happening in one place at one time, but we see this across the religious scenarios in America today. 25,000 churches will close their doors in this 10-year cycle of 2020 to 2030, according to the National Council of Churches. So religion is going through some huge transformations, and what this all will mean will be extraordinarily important. My sense is this is not the end of liberal Jewish expression, it is the rethinking of how it modulates or fits into a new direction. It's part of the ongoing story that when we go through transitions, as we have done over this Enlightenment era, and now facing a technology era of AI and all sorts of possibilities of how people acquire ideas, embrace information, and live with a changing reality. And the undergirding of all of that for Jews is the sense that Jews are feeling less comfortable today in America than they have ever felt since the 1930s. And what does that tell us in terms of how they will find their sort of sweet spot, their place of connection and community? Will that be a revival of Jewish life, the renewal of the synagogue? Or will it be a moment in which we rechart and rethink the institutions going forward?
So we've left something out. You probably noticed that.
Talking about 4,000 years of Jewish history in 5 short sessions. But what's left out, of course, is, so we talked today about religious changes in Reform Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, Conservative Reconstructionist Judaism. We did leave out Chabad, which we could talk about if you'd like. But the next piece of it is the rise of European and American anti-Semitism, and then as a response, the rise of Zionism and the establishment of the State of Israel, and the rise of American Jewish political activity. So we've talked about the religious aspect today. What we'd like to do in our next session is talk about the politics and questions of power. And so what we'll do is we'll divide our next session into two. In the first half, we're going to talk about that, European anti-Semitism, the experience of the Holocaust, the rise of Zionism, the establishment of the State of Israel, and the changing political position of American Jews. That's going to be the first half. That'll bring us up to the present. And then we're going to turn to Brother Steve, and he's going to tell us what's going to happen in the next 20 years. Actually, what we're going to do, to be more honest with you, is we're going to give you a bingo card. No, I'm very serious. So that you can track by yourselves the trends. You'll be able to track the trends and see where the next revolution is going to take us. Because as we said from the very beginning of our conversation, some sessions ago, we're in the middle of a period of revolution. And we don't know exactly where it's going to land. But we can see what the elements of that revolution are and begin to see some of the trends and begin to understand where it might land. So we're going to give you some indications so you can keep score and decide maybe it'll end up here. Or better yet, you can join the revolution and shape it in the way that you think ought to be done. Thank you for listening. Here's the announcement. So next week is the Holy Thanksgiving. Okay, I expect each of you to be stuffed with turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie next week, and sleepy as heck. So we won't have a session next week. You'll be way too sleepy. Okay, but the following Thursday night, which is the following Wednesday night, which is December the 3rd, at 7:30 will be our closing session. The first half about Zionism, anti-Semitism, and what got us to the present moment. The second half about where the revolution might be taking us. And that'll be our next conversation. Before we conclude, because we've really done a great job in stifling questions, we'll pick up Michael's question next time about the New York Times, because it has to do with the whole question of American Jewish life. Any other immediate questions about what we learned today? Yes? All right, what do you got? Something for next week?
Well, Hindus and Muslims and some of the other sects in India.
Yeah.
Are they escaping this, or we're just escaping the changes that are going on?
It's a great question. And she wants to know about Hindus and Muslims. Some year we'll do a whole session, 5 sessions on Hindus and Muslims and modernity. I'm kidding. That was a joke. No, there are the same, as I understand it from my Muslim friends here in America. It's different in Saudi Arabia. But in America, Muslim families are going through much of the same processes that we went through a generation ago. I was invited to the Islamic Center for a conference, and I sat in a study group with a guy who was a beautiful guy. He's a doctor, Muslim doctor, lives out in Simi Valley, and he's complaining to me that he just can't get his kids to come to the mosque on Fridays. And I said, I wouldn't know anything about that. I mean, you come to synagogue, all my kids are, his kids play Little League. His kids are in Boy Scouts, and Cub Girl Scouts. His kids are in, drama and karate. His kids are in public and private schools. And he's a religious Muslim, and he's trying to make the same kind of jumps that we're trying to make. And his leaders, his imam happens to be a dear friend of mine, educated at Berkeley. His imam is struggling with much of the same issues that we have, but Islam never had a reform movement. And because Islam never had a reform movement, it didn't go through the same pattern of acculturation and change that we went through, that Steve has described tonight. And so they're beginning that process now, and he's getting a lot of pushback from the newer Muslim immigrants who are much more, as we say, Orthodox Muslim, and it's a big issue. I said to him, there's a Muslim center, a mosque not far from here. He said, don't go there. They won't talk to you. He said, you're not their kind of, they don't want to talk because they're in a different place. So there's a lot of the same kinds of issues going on, but they're 2 generations behind us. That's what I know about that, but I'm not an expert, so please don't quote me. Yes, Farzan.
So it seems to me that the Orthodox, let's say, they are more...
I love this. It goes through this.
They are more into discovering more and more in depth of what was revealed, revelation. But all the other ones are based on reason and their own reason,
Yeah.
and not revelation. Am
There's no such thing as revelation without reason, because as you know, we always read Torah with a commentary. Right? Solomon Schechter was right, basically. We always read Torah as it's interpreted by the tradition. Okay? The question is, how much of modern forms, modern ideas, do you admit into that conversation? There's no such thing as an orthodoxy, even the most ultra orthodoxy that you can think of, that isn't affected by modernity in some way. I'll give you a great example. The most ultra-Orthodox group that I know of is called Neturei Karta, which means Guardians of the Gates, and it's a Lithuanian yeshiva orthodoxy. It's located mostly in Jerusalem, although there's a little bit of in Brooklyn. They are as frum as can be, and they have a website where they advertise who they are. Right? And they're the guys who protest against Israel. They're guys, but wait a minute. If you're protesting against Israel, you're acknowledging that there's an Israel. And you're living in my world, and you're acknowledging that protest is a form of political discourse that you wish to engage in. In other words, whether you like it or not, in some ways you are encountering the modern world. And so the question really is, how much modernity seeps in, how much modernity changes? There is today a modern Orthodox yeshiva called Maharat, ordaining women as Orthodox rabbis. Now, there are many people who thought that would never happen. It's happening. And they're all over the community now doing beautiful, beautiful work, right? There are others who say that's not kosher. But in every situation of orthodoxy, as well as every other denomination, as professors pointed out, things are changing. Things are really changing, and changing way more quickly than anyone thought they were. And so there is, even within an orthodoxy which says, I want to maintain the way that my ancestors did it, they're still using tools of modernity that can't help but change the structure and thinking of their religious lives. So that's where we are. Okay? Yeah, Andy, hi.
Mordecai Kaplan lived through the Holocaust,
He did.
but yet is not reflected in his teaching, so is it?
There was a great philosopher about the same time as Mordecai Kaplan named Isaiah Berlin, taught at Oxford. And he said, there are two kinds of thinkers, the fox and the hedgehog. The fox knows many, many things. The hedgehog knows one thing, but really well. Okay? Mordecai Kaplan was a hedgehog. He came up with one idea. Every one of his dozen books says the same idea over again. It's a brilliant idea. It's a remarkable idea. It's a Copernican idea, but it's one idea. And therefore, he couldn't adjust his thinking when the Holocaust came, and he kept with that idea, which is part of the reason why he is out of fashion at the moment. See, his idea that Judaism is a peoplehood, its culture is a culture of peoplehood, and that Judaism is aiming toward a messianic age in which the world is naturally moving in that direction, and we have to help it along. That God is the power that makes for salvation, he said. That was a great idea through the 1970s. And then what happened is, and you could see this in the reform movement's expression, after Vietnam, after we became really aware of the Holocaust, we began questioning modernity itself. We began questioning science and whether all science is really good. We began questioning progress. How many of you remember the exhibition at Disneyland called the Carousel of Progress? It's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow, shining at the end of every day. Because in every generation, we have new products created by General Electric Corporation. And then came you and me when we were young and had hair and said, that may have been true for our parents, but my idea of utopia is not a better television set. It's a different attitude toward life. And so as we began to question modernity and its ethic of progress, we began to look for different sources of inspiration, and the community departed from Heschel, from Kaplan, and moved over to Rabbi Heschel's, a different way of thinking of Judaism. And so it's a really interesting history. Just as a commercial, because I have no shame, coming in the end of February, there's a wonderful historian in Washington named Jenna Weissman Roseblit, who's just written a beautiful biography of Mordecai Kaplan, and I'm going to interview her for 3 sessions. It'll be online. You can get it online. It's going to be put out by the Melton people. We'll put it out too. It's free. It'll be broadcast around 4 o'clock our time and then recorded and posted later if you want to come home from work. And you can hear about this conversation of who Kaplan was and what happened to him, what happened to his ideas. Okay? But what basically happened to his ideas as we began to question the idea of progress and modernity and ask for alternative ways of thinking about life and thinking about our futures, we departed from Kaplan's ideas of Judaism and moved over to the spirituality of Abraham Joshua Heschel. And for those of you who knew Rabbi Schulweis, that had big implications for Schulweis, because at the end of Schulweis's famous book, For Those Who Can't Believe, he admits that this isn't working with young people, which is an incredible thing for a guy who writes a book called For Those Who Can't Believe, and at the end of the book he says he still doesn't believe, right? No, it really was a confession, and he realized that it was a generational thing. This new generation wanted something different out of their Judaism, and that's what happened to It's a long story, and we'll come back to that, but thank you. Couple of more questions, and yes, Elaine, hi.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks to both of you. Every other sentence that both of you said evoked something in me I wanted to ask questions. So David's going to get the benefit of all these questions. The
Good.
one thing that I wanted
David, I'll be up late if you want to call.
I won't be.
is that, are we aware that we now say we are Jewish Americans and not American Jews?
Yeah,
And I listened to you, you used both terms.
I do, yeah.
During your speech here. And I've checked this, and it happened when Joe Lieberman became the candidate for vice president. We became Jewish Americans. I was so aware of it at the time. And we were always American Jews. And doesn't that change the whole perspective?
Steve, you're better at this than me. You give it.
So I think, Elaine, that what's happened is that we are so much more conscious now of our Jewish sort of stake in America and the issue of, for some of us, of being homeless or politically homeless. And it's sort of recalibrated the language we're using. And I think that's part of that story. And I mean, that's also a sense of the affirmation with Joe Lieberman that this was a feel-good moment for American Jews, whether you supported his ticket or not. The fact is that he represented, and that moment represented, something profoundly important.
Thank you.
Someone else had a, yes, please, yes, please.
Okay, this is probably very controversial, it may not be in this discussion, but what about the Jews in America who identify being Jewish, but are a little bit shamed or shy about what has been happening in Israel recently?
Yeah, that's what we'll talk about next time, because that's what Israel. The whole question of what Israel is to us. What is Israel to us? How does Israel affect me? Right? The simple question, it's really very simple. If you've ever had a non-Jewish friend and try to explain to them what Israel is to you, they'll say to you, like, what is Israel to you? You say, well, Israel's my homeland. I say, but you live in Encino. But it's my homeland. So how often? You must go there twice, 3, 4, 5 times a year. So I haven't been there since my bar mitzvah. So what kind of homeland did you only go once in your lifetime? I mean, what, you know? I have Irish friends who have visited Ireland, but they don't say Ireland's my homeland. It happens to be where my ancestors came from. So what exactly is Israel to you, to us, to all of us? And how does Israel affect me? Then, now, what? What does it mean? where does it live in my Jewishness? All this next time on The Twins, Navigating the Revolutions of American Judaism. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Have a happy Thanksgiving.